He thought moving into this neighborhood would be the beginning of peace. The kind of place where his children could run on green lawns and ride their bikes down wide streets without fear. Where his wife could finally breathe without worrying about sirens or gunshots outside their window, where the word home would mean safety. But the moment the moving truck pulled in, he realized the street wasn't welcoming. Bemet was watching them. Curtains twitched, blinds snapped shut, and silence spread like a thick fog. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with curiosity, but the kind that carries judgment, the kind that whispers, "You don't belong here." Within days, the letters started coming, slipped into their mailbox, stamped with the seal of the HOA, written in clipped, officious language that barely disguised its venom. The grass was too long. The trash cans were unsightly. Their car, parked neatly by the curb, was suddenly a violation. Yet, when he walked the block, he saw neighbors with overgrown lawns, broken fences, peeling paint, and not a single letter taped to their doors. His family was singled out, targeted, not for what they did, but for who they were. At first he tried to comply, trimming, repainting, adjusting, convincing himself that maybe this was just about rules. Maybe if he followed every line, they would leave him alone. But it wasn't about rules, it was about power. The letters turned into visits. A knock at the door, loud and deliberate, and there stood a man in uniform. Not just any neighbor, but a police officer who also sat on the HOA board. His badge gleamed in the sun, as if to remind the family that his authority didn't stop when he left the station. He smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a neighbor, it was the smirk of someone who knew he could make life miserable with the stroke of a pen. He pointed at the mailbox and said it was too old-fashioned. He said the porch light was too dim. He measured the fence with a tape measure while children from other houses whispered and giggled nearby. Each time, he wrote notes on his clipboard, as if their very existence was a crime to be documented. The humiliation was relentless. The father watched as the officer strolled the street with a swagger, nodding to the white neighbors while narrowing his eyes at their home. Sometimes, he would park his squad car directly in front of their driveway, lights flashing for no reason, just sitting there, daring them to say something. The children stopped playing outside, retreating behind curtains, where they whispered to each other, asking why the officer hated them, why their house was always the one he visited. Their mother tried to smile, tried to reassure them, but her hands trembled as she packed their lunches, her eyes scanning the street for the next shadow of authority. The father felt the weight pressing down harder every day, the invisible message growing louder. Asterisk, leave, get out. People like you don't belong here. And yet he stayed. Because leaving would mean surrendering, proving them right, confirming their belief that a black family couldn't stand strong in a white neighborhood. But the officer pushed further, escalating the pressure. He made examples of them at HOA meetings, reading out their supposed violations with a tone that dripped with mockery. He told other residents that the family was lowering property values, planting seeds of resentment. Whispers spread, doors closed, invitations never came. And then came the night when the harassment crossed a line so sharp it could never be ignored again. The officer, drunk on power and blind to the consequences of his hatred, took one step too far, exposing his cruelty not just to the family but to everyone watching. That night would not only shatter the silence of the neighborhood, but ignite a reckoning no one saw coming. Because when the system meant to protect turns into a weapon of racism, the question isn't just how long one family can endure, it's what happens when their pain finally becomes impossible to ignore. The house looked perfect on paper. 2 stories of brick and siding with a small porch, trimmed hedges, and a backyard big enough for the kids to play soccer in. A dream pulled from glossy brochures and real estate ads that promised security and status, the kind of home that whispered opportunity to families who wanted more. For Marcus, that house was more than walls and windows. It was a symbol of every sacrifice he had made, every overtime shift, every night he came home exhausted, but determined to build something better for his wife Lila and their 2 children. They had lived too long in cramped apartments where neighbors shouted through thin walls, where sirens pierced the night, where safety was something you prayed for but rarely felt. Here, in this white picket fence neighborhood, wrapped in wide roads and manicured lawns, he thought they could finally rest, breathe, and live without the constant edge of survival. The neighborhood itself gleamed with uniform perfection. Every lawn cut the same length. Every driveway holding polished SUVs, every porch lit with warm lights that gave the illusion of friendliness. Yet beneath that uniform glow was something colder, a chill that Marcus felt the very first day they moved in, when the neighbors did not walk over to say hello, did not bring a plate of cookies, did not even offer a wave. Instead, he caught glimpses: curtains shifting, blinds closing, children being called inside mid-play, as his own kids stepped into the yard with wide, hopeful smiles that faded when they realized no one wanted to join them. For Lila, the house was supposed to mean community, a chance to finally belong to something bigger than themselves. But what she felt was the opposite: isolation wrapped in civility, silence sharpened into judgment. Their kids noticed it too, though they tried not to say it out loud. The way their classmates at the new school eyed them carefully, as if waiting to categorize them. The way teachers hesitated when pronouncing their last name, lingering just long enough to make it clear they weren't used to families like theirs living here. And then there was the HOA, a shadow that seemed to loom over every decision they made. At first, the letters had seemed almost comical: a warning about their trash cans being visible on collection day, a note about the grass needing to be cut half an inch shorter, a complaint about their mailbox being outdated. Marcus told himself these were just the rules, that if they followed them precisely, the attention would fade. But the truth was clear: the moment he compared their so-called violations to the neighbors. He could walk down the street and see cracked fences, peeling shutters, overstuffed garbage bins, and yet no envelopes taped to those doors, no fines issued, no warnings delivered. Their family, and their family alone, was under the microscope. The tension thickened with every knock at the door. Every letter slipped into the mailbox. Every stare from the white officer who chaired the HOA board. Officer Randall, as he introduced himself that first week, carried his authority like a weapon disguised as a smile. To the other neighbors, he was a protector, a man of the law ensuring standards were upheld. But to Marcus, Randall was something else entirely: a reminder that power, when mixed with prejudice, could strangle freedom, even in the quietest suburbs. He would park his squad car across the street under the guise of patrolling, but it was always in front of Marcus's house, always with those piercing eyes fixed on them. He'd walk over with his clipboard, measuring the fence, taking photos of the front yard, noting the tiniest imperfections, while families nearby waved and laughed as if nothing was wrong. Marcus felt the humiliation in his chest like a tightening. Not the kind of anger you couldn't show, because showing it would be exactly what they want today: confirmation of their worst assumptions. Lila tried to soften it, planting flowers, painting shutters, doing everything she could to make the house not just compliant, but beautiful. But even then, the letters came. Even then, the visits continued. The children, once excited to explore their new world, began to shrink from it, choosing the safety of their rooms over the outside stairs, their laughter fading into silence. And still, Marcus told himself to hold on, to endure, because this was their dream, and he would not let it be stolen, not by a hostile neighborhood, not by an HOA board hiding its bigotry behind bylaws, and certainly not by a police officer who believed a badge gave him the right to decide who belonged. Yet beneath that resolve lingered a question Marcus could not ignore. How much longer could they endure before the pressure broke them? Before one confrontation pushed things past the point of no return? The house had been meant to bring peace, but instead, it carried the weight of a war Marcus never asked for but now could not escape. A battle not of laws or rules but of dignity, belonging, and survival. At first, Marcus tried to convince himself that the constant warnings and letters were nothing more than bureaucracy, that maybe he was overthinking the difference between his situation and his neighbors. But the evidence piled up until denial was no longer possible, each day cutting deeper into his sense of dignity. Each moment confirming that he and his family had been marked as outsiders, The HOA fines escalated with astonishing speed. $100 for improper lawn maintenance, even though he had mowed just the day before. Another $200 for a basketball hoop his kids had set up in the driveway while 3 houses down, a white family's hoop stood untouched for months. Their yard cluttered with bikes and toys, yet never once receiving a citation. Every morning brought new dread. The walk to the mailbox turning into a ritual of humiliation as Marcus pulled out another envelope bearing Randall's neat, threatening handwriting. The officer always signed his name with authority, as if reminding Marcus that this wasn't just about HOA rules, this was about who controlled the narrative, who controlled the neighborhood, and who controlled him. Soon, the neighbors began to join in the silent campaign of exclusion. Invitations to community barbecues never arrived. Neighborhood kids crossed the street to avoid playing with Marcus's children, and friendly smiles given to others turned to icy stares when directed toward his family. It was a suffocating loneliness, made worse by the knowledge that it wasn't random, it was deliberate, orchestrated, a system designed to grind them down until they either submitted completely or left. The humiliation didn't stop at home, either. When Lila went jogging through the neighborhood, Randall's cruiser would appear behind her, headlights cutting the early morning haze. Crawling at a pace slow enough to be unmistakable, but fast enough to keep her heart racing with unease. He would follow her until she turned back toward her own house, and though he never rolled down the window, his presence said everything. Asterisk, you are not safe here, you do not belong here. Remember who's watching you. Asterisk, Marcus felt his blood boil. Each time Lila returned with shaken hands and trembling lips, yet he also felt the cruel trap tightening if he confronted Randall. If he showed even a flicker of defiance, the man's badge would turn into a weapon, and Marcus knew the consequences could ruin his family's lives in ways far beyond HOA fines. The children weren't spared from the cruelty either. At school, whispers followed them down hallways. Cruel comments slipped from the mouths of classmates who mimicked the words they likely heard at their dinner tables. Troublemakers, outsiders, not from here. And when Marcus's son tried to stand up for himself, it was he who got detention while the white boys who pushed him were dismissed with warnings. Even their teachers, who should have been protectors, seemed eager to believe the worst. Their eyes narrowing just a little more when addressing Marcus's children, their patience running thinner than it did with others. Every night at the dinner table, Marcus could see the light in his children's eyes dimming. The carefree laughter that once filled their small apartment, shrinking into silence in the spacious dining room of their so-called dream home. They asked questions he couldn't bear to answer. Asterisk, why doesn't anyone want to be our friend? Why does Mr. Randall hate us? Did we do something wrong? He wanted to tell them the truth, that they had done nothing wrong, that the only crime they had committed was existing in a space that some people believed should remain untouched by families like theirs. But what good would that do? How could he explain to children the depth of a hatred so old, so ingrained, it hid behind rules and regulations, disguising itself as fairness while bleeding them slowly? Marcus carried it all in silence, burying his fury under layers of composure. Yet each day, the weight grew heavier. The neighborhood seemed to conspire against him at every turn. Packages mysteriously vanished from their porch while delivery. Trucks passed other houses without issue. Their trash can was deliberately knocked over on collection days. Their car tires punctured with nails placed so neatly it was impossible to believe it was random. Each incident, Marcus reported to Randall, desperate to document the harassment. But each time, the officer would take notes with a smirk, then close the notebook with a shrug, claiming there was no evidence, as though daring Marcus to push harder, daring him to snap so the punishment could be swift and brutal. Lila began to withdraw, her bright smile fading into shadows, her garden neglected because she no longer wanted to step outside where eyes followed her every movement. The kids retreated into themselves, their voices muted, their joy suffocated. And Marcus, standing in the middle of it all, felt like he was drowning in invisible chains that no one else could see but that defined every moment of their existence. What made it worse, what twisted the knife deeper, was the silence of those around them. The neighbors who could have spoken up, but didn't. The families who watched injustice unfold on their very street, but chose complicity over courage, pretending not to notice the harassment, because acknowledging it might shatter their illusion of peace. Marcus realized then that the neighborhood was not just a collection of houses, it was a stage. And his family had been cast in a role they had no choice but to play, a role defined by exclusion, suspicion, and humiliation. And Randall, with his badge, his clipboard, and his smirk, was both director and enforcer, ensuring the performance continued exactly as scripted. The rising tension built to unbearable heights, leaving Marcus trapped between rage and restraint. His family suffering while the walls of their dream home began to feel less like protection and more like a prison designed to remind them of their place. The injustice was no longer subtle, it was blatant, it was relentless, and it was escalating, pushing Marcus closer and closer to a breaking point that he feared yet knew was inevitable. Because no man could endure forever the daily erosion of his dignity, the steady theft of his family's joy, without something inside him finally snapping. The breaking point came on a sweltering summer afternoon, when the air hung heavy with heat and tension that felt almost alive, pressing against Marcus's chest with every breath, as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable eruption. That morning, Marcus had woken to find yet another violation letter shoved crudely under his door, this time not even mailed. Just delivered like a slap in the face, claiming his children's chalk drawings on the driveway were graffiti and a threat to community standards. It was the most absurd, most insulting accusation yet, but it wasn't just the words, it was the threat scrawled at the bottom in Randall's unmistakable block letters, final warning before legal escalation. Marcus's hands trembled as he read it, not from fear, but from the fury he had buried for weeks. Fury now boiling over. By the time the sun was high overhead, his children were outside, innocent and laughing, trying to reclaim some small piece of joy with their colored chalk, sketching flowers and suns across the concrete. Then came the sound, a low, deliberate growl of tires crunching against asphalt. Randall's police cruiser crept up the street like a predator stalking prey. Its siren lights off, but its presence louder than any alarm, stopping right in front of Marcus's driveway, as if claiming the ground belonged to him. The laughter of the children died instantly, their chalk dropping from small hands as they stared wide-eyed at the looming vehicle. Marcus stepped out, sweat rolling down his temples, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. But he forced himself to stand tall, his body tense with a courage born not of choice but of necessity. Randall emerged slowly, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming in the punishing sun, and his smirk already plastered across his face. He didn't address Marcus at first. Instead, he looked down at the chalk drawings, then at the children, his lips curling into something that was neither smile nor frown but pure contempt. Violation, he muttered loudly enough for the neighbors who were now peeking through blinds and cracked doors to hear. And with the arrogance of a man who knew he controlled the script, he pulled out his clipboard. "This is your last strike, Williams. You're poisoning the community with your habits." His words dripped venom, his eyes narrowing with the satisfaction of a predator who believed the prey was already trapped. Marcus felt his entire body shake, but this time it wasn't with restraint, it was with release. He stepped forward, closing the space between himself and Randall until he could see his own reflection in the officer's mirrored sunglasses, until the tension between them was so thick it vibrated in the air. "Enough," Marcus said, his voice low but steady, the words slicing through the stifling silence of the street. Randall's smirk widened, almost eager, as his hand drifted to the holster on his hip, fingers resting on the cold metal of his gun, a silent reminder of the power he held, of the danger Marcus now faced. The children whimpered behind their father, and Leela rushed out to pull them close, her face pale with fear but her eyes blazing with defiance as she stood beside her husband. Marcus knew that in this moment, every second, every word mattered, that one wrong move could end everything. But something inside him had shifted. The fear that had once shackled him was burned away by the sight of his children clutching at their mother. Their joy destroyed by a man drunk on his own authority. He could no longer endure being silent, no longer bear to bend under the weight of humiliation. With his voice rising, breaking through the hush of the neighborhood, Marcus shouted so the entire block could hear, "We are not your prisoners. We are not your targets. You will not take our home from us." His words echoed against stucco walls and manicured lawns, shattering the performative peace of the neighborhood. For a moment, Randall froze, his arrogance faltering as the sheer force of Marcus's defiance hit him. But then, red-faced and trembling with rage, he lunged forward, barking, "You people don't belong here." The slur, unspoken but hanging heavy in the venom of his words, cracked open the facade that had cloaked his hatred in rules and citations. The neighbors, once silent spectators, gasped audibly. Blinds fluttered, phones began recording, and, suddenly, the stage Randall had controlled so effortlessly was slipping from his grasp. His hand twitched on his holster, his entire body vibrating with the fury of a man whose authority had been challenged in front of witnesses. But Marcus did not move back. He stood like stone, every muscle braced, his chest heaving with defiance, his gaze unflinching, daring Randall to follow through. The tension was unbearable, the air charged with the possibility of violence, of tragedy, of an irreversible fracture that would scar not just this family, but the entire neighborhood. Seconds stretched into eternities, every heartbeat loud enough to be heard, until the sound of a voice shaky but strong rose from across the street, "Leave them alone." It was a neighbor, then another, and another. Their courage finally pried open by Marcus's stand, their silence broken as the truth spilled into the open. Phones were raised higher, eyes locked on Randall, the weight of scrutiny now pressing against him instead of Marcus. For the first time, Randall looked unsettled, his smirk faltering, his hand retreating slowly from the gun as he realized the narrative had shifted, the control slipping from his hands. Marcus, though trembling with adrenaline, knew in his bones that something had changed forever. He had faced the beast head-on, endured the humiliation, carried the weight, and finally, with his family beside him and the eyes of the community watching, he had refused to break. The silence that followed was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever felt, thick, charged, almost sacred, because everyone knew something irreversible had just taken place. Randall, once the untouchable enforcer who wielded his badge like a weapon and the HOA like a shield, now stood stripped of his false authority, his arrogance crumbling beneath the eyes of witnesses and the cameras that recorded his every sneer and threat. He muttered something about just doing his job, but the words rang hollow, too weak to cover the venom he had revealed, and with every passing second, the neighbors' stares bored deeper into him. No longer blind, no longer silent accomplices. Marcus's chest rose and fell with the weight of adrenaline. But for the first time in weeks, maybe years, he felt air filling his lungs without chains, without fear, without shame. His children, still clinging to Lila's side, looked up at him, not with terror, but with awe, their small faces lit by the glow of a father who refused to be broken. A man who had turned humiliation into defiance, and defiance into dignity. That night, whispers spread faster than the heat of the day. Headphones uploaded clips of Randall's outburst, his snarling words and his hand hovering over his gun, and within hours, the HOA that had once stood behind him began to distance themselves, scrambling to preserve their fragile reputation. By the end of the week, the officer who had made Marcus's life a nightmare was suspended. His name dragged into hearings and investigations, the mask he had worn for years ripped away by the undeniable truth of his actions. But more important than Randall's downfall was the shift within the neighborhood itself. The same people who once watched through blinds now stepped onto porches to greet Marcus and his family. Some with apologies, some with shame, and others with newfound courage to stand against the ugliness they had tolerated too long. For Marcus, victory wasn't in seeing Randall fall, it was in reclaiming his family's peace, in showing his children that they could live with their heads high, even in the face of hatred, that they belonged not because of permission, but because dignity cannot be evicted. The story did not end with fireworks or sudden perfection. Racism does not vanish overnight. Wounds do not heal with a single act of bravery. But the impact rippled outward like waves across the lake, a reminder that silence is complicity, that one voice can spark many, and that justice begins not in courtrooms or HOA meetings, but in the moment someone refuses to be silent, refuses to be erased. And as Marcus stood on his porch days later, watching his children once again fill the driveway with chalk flowers and suns, their laughter rising freely into the summer air, he realized that what had been stolen from them was not just dignity, but joy, and by standing tall, by refusing to bow to humiliation, he had given it back. It began on one of those heavy summer afternoons when the air felt thick enough to choke, the kind of day when even silence carried tension. And for Marcus Johnson, a hard-working father who had saved every penny to move his family into what was supposed to be a safe neighborhood, the air carried more than hate, it carried judgment. From the moment his family unpacked boxes and planted flowers along their porch, the stares began, long and lingering, as if their presence had cracked the pristine veneer of the community. The homeowners association had rules, endless ones, about grass length, paint colors, trash bins, but those weren't what truly bothered the neighbors. What truly unsettled them was the sight of a black family settling among them, daring to claim space in a world that quietly believed it wasn't theirs. At first, it was subtle cold shoulders at community gatherings. Letters slipped into the mailbox about imaginary infractions, muffled whispers when Marcus walked his children to school. But it didn't take long before those whispers turned to sharpened glares, and those glares became complaints. And the complaints became something far more dangerous when Randall Pierce, a white police officer, and the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, decided Marcus and his family didn't belong. Randall wore his uniform like armor, strutting through the neighborhood as if every porch and every yard belonged to him. And with each passing week, his disdain for Marcus grew bolder. He scrutinized every detail: the toys left in the yard, the slightly faded shutters, the cars parked a few inches too close to the curb as, if proving Marcus unworthy would erase the deeper truth driving his anger, that he couldn't stand seeing a black man stand tall where he thought only certain people deserved to. What began as nitpicking soon escalated into harassment. Notices appeared almost weekly, citing violations others committed without consequence, while Marcus alone was called out, threatened with fines, threatened with eviction. Neighbors who once stayed silent began to gossip louder, emboldened by Randall's aggression, and soon, Marcus's children felt the sting of it too. Their chalk drawings on the driveway were smeared overnight, their basketball hoop mysteriously bent, their laughter replaced with whispers of confusion. Why were they different? Why did people look at them with disdain? Marcus, who had built his life on quiet resilience, tried to shield them, to remind them that dignity mattered more than cruelty. But even he felt the weight pressing in. The rising tension reached its peak when Randall didn't just arrive as a neighbor, but as a cop, pulling into Marcus's driveway with flashing lights, demanding answers for fabricated accusations of noise complaints and disorderly conduct. His hand hovered near his gun as if waiting for an excuse, his voice dripping with venom as he accused Marcus of being a disturbance, a threat, an outsider. The sight of his children trembling behind the curtains carved something deep into Marcus' heart, a mix of rage, fear, and despair. This was no longer about HOA rules or neighborhood politics. This was about survival, about dignity under siege, about a man being told he didn't belong in a place he had worked so hard to call home. The injustice burned so hot it felt suffocating, yet Marcus knew that bending under it would only prove Randall right, and so he stood his ground, even as every instinct screamed of danger. The confrontation that followed became the breaking point, the moment when simmering racism boiled into something undeniable. With neighbors gathering on their porches, phones recording, Randall unleashed the full force of his prejudice. He barked accusations, twisted lies into truths, painted Marcus as a menace, a man who didn't deserve the roof over his head. The tension was unbearable. every second stretching like a wire about to snap. Randall's face contorted with fury, veins bulging as he spat words meant to humiliate, to strip Marcus of his humanity. He stepped closer, invading space with the weight of his badge and the power it represented. Daring Marcus to flinch, daring him to react so he could justify the hatred already burning in his eyes. For Marcus, it was a crucible of fire. Stand silent and let his family see him broken, or stand tall and risk everything. And in that moment, he chose dignity. He refused to bow, refused to lower his gaze, refused to give Randall the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. That act of defiance, silent but immovable, shifted the air in a way words never could. Neighbors, who once hid behind blinds, now found themselves exposed. Witnesses to a raw display of power and cruelty, and their silence began to tremble under the weight of truth. Cameras captured every word, every glare, every sneer. And in the unblinking eye of those lenses, Randall's mask began to slip, his cruelty undeniable. His hatred caught in the very act of being wielded. The fallout was swift and unrelenting. By nightfall, the video spread through the neighborhood, then the city, then beyond, igniting outrage that no amount of denial could smother. Randall, once shielded by his uniform and his HOA authority, now found himself cornered by the very exposure he had invited. The HOA scrambled to protect their image, distancing themselves from his actions, while city officials announced investigations into his conduct. For Marcus and his family, the days that followed were a blur of cautious relief. Neighbors approaching with apologies they should have spoken years earlier. Voices rising in support where silence once reigned. Yet beneath the relief was a sobering truth. Randall was not just one man, but a symptom of something deeper. A sickness woven into the fabric of their lives. A reminder that justice was fragile and fleeting, unless fought for with relentless courage. But what endured, stronger than fear, was the transformation within Marcus's family. His children, who had once looked upon him with fear as Randall's shadow loomed, now looked upon him with pride, their eyes wide with the knowledge that their father had stood against hatred and reclaimed their dignity. They began to laugh again, to play, to draw chalk flowers and suns on the driveway without hesitation. Their joy no longer stolen, but defiantly reclaimed. And so, the story closed, not with perfect resolution, but with a question that lingered far beyond Marcus's home. How many more must endure humiliation before silence breaks? How many families must be told they don't belong before communities learn that belonging isn't granted by prejudice but by humanity itself? The truth of Randall's downfall was important, yes. But the greater truth was this. Marcus's stand was more than survival. It was a declaration that racism cannot strip away worth, that dignity cannot be evicted, that courage in the face of cruelty ripples outward, sparking change where silence once suffocated. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, Marcus stood on his porch, his children's laughter echoing into the evening. A quiet reminder that victory is not the absence of hate, but the refusal to let it define you. Perhaps the question for us, the witnesses of stories like these, is not whether racism exists, we know it does, but whether we are willing to stand against